This is a short video to introduce the ArchiveMethod ecosystem. Just what is the ArchiveMethod ecosystem? It's a fancy term, ecosystem. I use this broad term because it's somewhat difficult to pigeonhole ArchiveMethod. It's made up of several pieces. There's a database, there's a macro, and there are components. All of these things are working together to make the ArchiveMethod ecosystem. Here I'm just going to show a few of the highlights of what working in the ArchiveMethod ecosystem provides the developer. Which of these pieces do you actually see in your day-to-day code? There are two primarily. One is a database of all the code you've ever written, and the other is a text file, which is accumulating all the new and modified code in the recent time frame. You can see here the database showing all of the method from all of the projects that I've worked on. There are over 17,000 methods contained in this example database. Over here is the text file that has been faithfully recording all of my recent work: new code, refactored code, and debugged code. The idea of ArchiveMethod started with a desire to preserve all of my code creation and modification as I worked. As you're probably aware, it's very frustrating to lose code that you've developed. It can be difficult and depressing to recreate this material even though you might have come up with it originally only a few hours earlier. Why does this problem ever occur? Dramatic examples are hardware failure. For example, an electrical outage or a hard disk crash. Software failure can have a similar effect, with some crashing bug in 4D abruptly ending your session. If you're lucky, you can emerge from these crashes unscathed, but occasionally you'll get a notification that your database project is corrupted and cannot be repaired. You're forced to use a backup copy. Even if you're fairly diligent about backup, this can still be annoying for two reasons. The first is simply that the backup is old, perhaps an hour, perhaps a few hours, perhaps a few days, depending on how diligent you are and the circumstances under which you are doing your work. The second problem is that it can be difficult to remember precisely what the state of that backup is, just how much of your recent work is actually incorporated in that backup. Has this or that method been updated? Just what methods have in fact been changed in the last day? ArchiveMethod can help here. Annoying as they are, these hard crashes are not very common. More frequently, in my experience, is a more mundane issue. I will embrace some new idea and plunge enthusiastically forward, changing my code base, confident that this is a new, good direction. Sometimes I will recognize that I'm about to go off into uncharted, possibly treacherous territory, and will make a backup of the structure file before I commence. But other times it doesn't seem that it really warrants stepping out of the program and creating the backup before going back to work. It might seem like a pretty routine improvement. Occasionally, however, despite my initial enthusiasm, I find that I've really gone down an errant pathway. I can get pretty deep in my code with fairly extensive changes before I realize that in fact this new idea is a bad idea and it creates some unanticipated problem, and I'm really better off retreating. The trouble at this point can be that I can't precisely remember all the code that I've touched in making what I thought was going to be an improvement. Perhaps most of the time I was working on a single method, but I wandered around the code base making little tweaks here and there to adapt the system to the new code. But now I've decided the whole thing is a mistake. How do I unwrap it all? Since ArchiveMethod has kept a diary of all the changes that I made and all the methods that I worked on, this is a vastly simpler thing to do when I've been working under the umbrella of ArchiveMethod. ArchiveMethod is very valuable in this regard. I find it really helpful because the fear engendered by these sort of concerns is alleviated, and I find myself, in fact, more willing to try new things without the paralysis engendered by a fear of breaking something during the refactoring. With ArchiveMethod, I'm confident I can retrace my steps and not run the risk of leaving my database project in some sort of half-new, half-old state. You can see here a day's worth of work preserved as a text document. Coding started about noon. This text document is created and appended automatically as I work. Now if I find the need to go back to a backup copy, say one obtained at 1500 hours, I can look at this table of contents and determine all of the changes that have occurred subsequently and decide how to deal with the situation. This simple system of having a text file continuously being appended with any of the changes that are being made in your code as those changes are made is powerful unto itself and addresses many of the concerns that prompted me to develop ArchiveMethod in the first place. Obviously, over time, this text file becomes unwieldy as it continually increases in size. It seems a shame to simply throw it out and start again when it gets too big. The solution is simply to take all of that information in that text file and bring it into the ArchiveMethod database, the database that's included in the ArchiveMethod ecosystem. That database is easily capable of storing the thousands of versions of code that accumulate over time. The way the ArchiveMethod system works is that every now and then, one fires up the database portion of the ArchiveMethod ecosystem and grabs all of the data that is stored in the text file and brings it into a database for future reference. The source text file is deleted after giving up its contents. When you return to coding, a new text file is created to preserve all the new code and modified code that you are creating. The database of all the versions of your code becomes a resource unto itself. Whether you're working on one project or multiple 4D projects, all of your code is now stored in a single location. If you want to find some piece of code that you dimly remember having written a year or two ago, it's easy to find, even if you're not sure exactly what project you wrote the code for. Often problems in coding come up that are similar to problems that you've encountered before, but perhaps not something that you anticipated encountering again. By having all the code of all of your projects stored in a single location, it makes it much simpler to try and find the old work you've done so it can be reused and remodeled for the current problem that you've encountered. Similarly, there are 4D commands that are rarely required and complicated enough that they do not become second nature. When I encounter the need for such a command, it's useful to go back and look at my previous work to see where I might have used that command before and exactly how I handled its input and output. In this way, I'm reusing my previous work that I may have largely forgotten about in my current project. The official 4D documentation may be great, but it's not a complete substitute to seeing how I actually used the command in some other project from a year ago. For example, I may need to use a blob in my current work, but I'm not very familiar with blob code, although I know that I've used it in some project in the past. Now I can search for the command blob to text and find all of my old methods in any project that use this command and refresh my memory and possibly recycle that code. Having a database easily searchable of all of your code provides the ability to examine what might seem to be peripheral issues, such as when code was created and how long it took for code to be finalized. Reports can be generated analyzing such things as your use of local variables in your code or your use of various 4D commands in your code. There are other features of the ArchiveMethod system that are explained in other videos and in the documentation. Once ArchiveMethod is set up, you can largely forget about it. It just operates in the background. Do not be intimidated by the amount of documentation that comes with ArchiveMethod. It is really not that complicated. The bulk of the documentation is provided just as a resource if some feature is confusing. Before I close, I'll show just one of the many bonus features that comes with the use of ArchiveMethod. ArchiveMethod is aware of all of the 1,000 plus commands of 4D. When you encounter a command with which you are somewhat unfamiliar, you can place information about that command onto the clipboard in a format that is suitable to be pasted right into the code itself as a comment. For example, let's say I want to learn about the command match regex. Highlight the command in your code and find the macro command info to clipboard. Now paste the clipboard contents right into your code window. The information now sits in the code as a comment available for reference while you're developing around that command. If you wish, you can leave that comment in there indefinitely, Or you can leave just a fragment of that material in your code, just enough so if you encounter this code several months later, you can jog your memory as to just what the command is supposed to accomplish. One line of the pasted code is a template for the use of that command. You can just fill in the parameters required. Thank you for your attention. I hope you will enjoy using ArchiveMethod.